It is only fitting that one of my first official duties of the SID president at this meeting should be to introduce the Naomi Kanof Lecture. The Kanof Award was established in 1988. Dr. Kanof served as associate editor for the JID for 10 years, from 1938 to 1948, its inception along with Marion Sulzberger. He was the initial primary editor. She then went on to serve as editor for a remarkable 18 years, from 1948 to 1967. During her time as the JID editor, both associate and editor-in-chief, she was in private practice in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kanof once summed up, Dr. Sulzberger summed up Dr. Kanof's qualities by stating, "I believe that Naomi's accomplishments is not any single one, but her ability to do so many things well." I believe that description is a perfect segue into my introduction of this year's Naomi Kanof Lecturer. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Sufi Chen, Professor of Dermatology at the Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Chen is an MIT-trained engineer who went on to medical school at Johns Hopkins. She trained in dermatology at Emory and then trained in health services and outcomes research at Stanford. Her choice at the time to choose the focus of health services research was risky and took courage. There were few dermatologists at the time who had ever even heard of HSR, let alone make a lifelong commitment to a central part of their life's work. Dr. Chen was very fortunate to be mentored by a great dermatology chair at the time, Dr. Wright Kaufman, who suggested that this field might be of interest and a career path might yield dividends. He was so right. I'm reminded of Amos Tversky, the intellectual partner of Daniel Kahneman of Thinking Fast and Slow fame, who was quoted as saying, "It is sometimes easier to make the world a better place than to prove that you have made the world a better place." Outcomes in health services research and Sufi Chen's pioneering work in this growing field lays out a roadmap for how we demonstrate where basic and applied skin research translates into making that world a better place that we are all seeking. It is difficult work because it deals with the needs, wants, and goals of people. And people are complicated. It is all about measuring what is important and very difficult to measure. I have known and worked with Sufi for more than 20 years. Like Naomi Kanof, she does many things well, and I could take up much of the time allocated to detailing all of this, but I won't do that. She has been a huge influence on me, our department, clinical practice, and outcomes research, and skin diseases in general, and it is my pleasure to introduce her as this year's Naomi Kanof awardee. Thank you.
So I want to thank Bob there for such a kind introduction. I also want to thank the Scientific Program Committee for giving not only me, but really all of the people in this room who do patient-oriented research this opportunity to give you an overview of patient-oriented research, outcomes research really, and emphasize why this is so important to everybody in this room. Anybody who is doing research, outcomes research is ultimately important to you. So by way of disclosure, our group does develop quality of life instruments for which we do receive royalties from for-profit types of companies. As mentioned, Dr. Kanof was quite the pioneer. I want to point out that she was chairman at a time when very few women actually took such leadership roles. She was also a big proponent of clinical research. She had a particular interest in allergic contact dermatitis. But during her tenure as the editor of the JID, we actually saw a decrease in the number of articles that were based in clinically oriented research. And we saw an increase in those types of articles that were in biochemistry and physiology. And this trend actually continued for some time. Bringing that landscape to a more recent time, actually, I think that the tide is turning a bit. So you can see in this orange graph that the clinical studies are starting to rise. And this is actually reflected not just only with the JID, but there are a lot of very good journals out there in our field that are now increasingly published impactful papers that are based in clinical studies. If you want to take a look at the number of articles cited, if you just go to the JID website now, you can find the 10 most cited articles in 2015. You can see with the pink circles that half of them are clinical studies, and a couple of them are actually outcomes research. But you know, this isn't about the H-index, and it isn't about the impact factor. To some people it might be, but really, this is about how science informs health. After all, it is called the National Institutes of Health. So this is our roadmap for the next 30 minutes. First of all, I'm going to talk about what is outcomes research and why is it important to bench scientists and clinical trialists. How does it fit into the overall rubric of research? And then I want to talk about the focus and impact of outcomes research and then land with what I call our true reality. So ideally what would happen is scientists at the bench would find something really interesting to study. And then that might be translated into something that could be tested in clinical trials. And ideally, these clinical trials go without a hitch, and it gets quickly approved by the FDA, and then it's deployed into the real world. Once it's in the real world, ideally, everything is hunky-dory, it's very acceptable, and people find it to be incredibly useful. Well, outcomes research is at that tail end there. We investigate what happens in the real world when patients, or if you want to call them consumers, use the therapies and the diagnostics that are developed by the scientists. So why is outcomes research so important to all researchers? Because it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a ton of money to do research well. So you want to be good stewards of that research money, and you want to make sure that it makes a difference in the real world and not produce what my 16-year-old calls garbage. We have a really wonderful recent example. So as you know, last year the Nobel Prize for Medicine went to two scientists that were able to describe, or to find that there's a way to stimulate the inherent ability of the immune system to attack tumor cells. And this established an entirely new principle for cancer therapy, including melanoma. This was successfully tested in clinical trials, and now patients who used to have very, very short survival span are now living, and living for a long time. In the South, we refer to this class of drug as the Jimmy Carter drug, and everybody knows what we're talking about. In this kind of paradigm, the best outcomes to measure are easy. It's life or death. But I would submit to you that in dermatology, we really don't save that many lives. So what are our outcomes? If you want to turn to a dermatology example, let's just take the evolizumab story. So this was one of the, in the class of first generations for psoriasis that the FDA approved in 2003. It passed through clinical trials and approval. But people started noticing that there were some neurologic issues. And after 4 cases of progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy were identified, the FDA and the European equivalent recommended suspension of the drug, and the company voluntarily withdrew it from the market. But I don't want to mislead you. Outcomes research is not post-marketing surveillance. So what is it? Well, let's first talk about the whole rubric of research and see how outcomes fits into that. So I'd submit to you that the goal of research is to help patients. This is done by all sorts of different types of researchers, and we're all here today in this room. So I'd submit to you that basic science researchers are trying to understand the disease by looking at etiology, pathophysiology, and trying to define the disease. The clinical epidemiologists are taking those definitions and making sure that it applies on a population level. They're also interested in developing diagnostic tests and also in quantifying and really defining what the risk factors and prognostic factors are of this disease. Once the disease is better understood, we want to use that information to help patients. Clinical trialists will then use information, use science, and in clinical studies try to figure out whether or not the disease is improved. Traditionally, it's been with objective outcomes using some physiological parameters. More recently, because of outcomes research, there are subjective outcomes, such as quality of life, that are incorporated. Outcomes researchers also fine-tune the physiologic parameters to make sure that they really are clinically relevant, and then they also make sure that these parameters are applied in the real world, and that's what distinguishes efficacy from effectiveness, which we'll talk about in a bit. Lastly, none of this is going to matter if you can't get the drug, the device, and whatnot to the patient. There are societal constraints in real life. If they can't have access to care, or if it's too expensive, or just the care paradigm is not very good, then you can't give this best medicine, this best science to the patient. And this type of research is what is called health services research. So a focus of outcomes research, too, are effectiveness and quality of life. We'll first focus on effectiveness. So effectiveness is not the same thing as efficacy. Efficacy is how well an intervention works in clinical trials. Clinical trials are contrived microcosms. They have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so it may not reflect the general population. Everything is so well controlled, as it should be. But once it's out in the real world, that's when things get really messy. And that's effectiveness, how well it works in real life. Because there are many different types of populations that maybe you didn't include in a large enough number in the clinical trial. There are other things to take into account too. Health literacy, different kinds of population, drug interactions, comorbidities, all these make it messy. So how do we measure effectiveness? Well, you could do chart reviews of selected sites. We'd like to do it on a larger basis, though, population-based. So there are Medicare claims databases. There are national surveys that are being deployed, but these have weaknesses. So for the clinicians in the room, you know you're just trying to get out of that visit, put something down so you can get paid. That's claims. You're not wearing a research hat when you put those codes down. Surveys are more deliberate. However, you can't think of everything that you want to measure ahead of time. So they may not have all the variables or the things that you want to adjust for captured from the get-go. I'm very optimistic, though. So this is why Bob and I get along. So I think that DataDerm is going to help. Like he alluded to in the last session, it's an academy initiative, a national registry for dermatologists, as well as other clinicians that provide dermatology care. Pushes and pulls data from the electronic medical record such that it can capture all relevant events. So we're talking about maybe pregnancies, metastases, maybe TB, reactivation, and we need to make sure that these are all measured under certain circumstances that are important, such as drug exposure, certain demographic adjustments, or comorbidity adjustments. And I want to emphasize that healthcare is changing. So we need to measure all of this in all different kinds of care paradigms, such as telederm. Quality of life is the other focus of outcomes research because, again, we really don't save a ton of lives as dermatologists. What we really do well and where we're most impactful is we improve quality of life. So this table here is some numbers that show you that providers are actually really poor proxies of rating patient quality of life. So you want to see these numbers in the 0.7 or higher range, and you can see they don't even come close. And that's because we don't correlate well with how patients rate their quality of life. Why is that? Don't we listen to our patients? Of course we do. but we may not really understand where they're coming from. So like for psoriasis, those of us who do trials understand what a PASI 90 is, but it doesn't really capture the post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. That patient may still not be able to wear their favorite shorts or their skirt. In atopic dermatitis or CTCL, sometimes you can't see the rash anymore. Sometimes that has really abated, but they're itching like crazy. So they have a huge quality of life impact. And then as we talked about in the last session, hidradenitis, there's a lot of pain involved, but maybe even after this is all quiescent, they really worry about whether or not they're going to have another flare and suffer that same pain. So as providers, I'm sure we sit down, we talk to our patients, and we take the time, but I think it's important to emphasize that we should quantify this burden of disease in order to move our science further. And how do we do that? Well, there are different kinds of instruments to do so. These are called health status instruments, and they exist on a continuum, anywhere from measuring general health all the way to being skin-specific, and finally, disease-specific. And I'm just going to give you a little flavor of what these might be like. So the SF-36 is the most popular, the most common of the general health type of health status measures. It's broken up into two summary measures. This one is the physical health, and you can see this is somewhat relevant to dermatology, but it's not very specific to dermatology. This is the mental health summary measure, and a lot of these items, again, are very relevant to dermatology, but again, it's not very specific. I want to put a shout out to Dr. Meg Kren for developing the Skindex, because unlike previous measures, this one actually incorporates emotion. So again, I think that a lot of our dermatologic diseases really do impact patients on an emotional level and not just a functional or symptom level. These disease-specific ones, the ones that I'm going to show you at least, have similar types of constructs, but they now have different items that are specific to the diseases. So the green text highlights those items that are different from the Skindex. The white is what was already in the Skindex. And you can see something like hard to go to the hairdresser would be specific to somebody who has an inflammatory scalp disorder. But sometimes you can't see the problem. And I'm not talking about delusions of parasitosis. I'm talking about conditions where it might be very painful, such as people with calciphylaxis or hidradenitis, or they can be super itchy, which, as we know from current research, is probably as bad as being in pain, and such as scabies, CTCL, some of the chronic conditions such as atopic dermatitis. So we need to ask the patients about the impact of things that we can't see. These are called patient-reported outcomes. So here's an example of some itch patient-reported outcomes. There's self-reported severity. It can range from the top here, where it's a visual analog scale, this is very well accepted, to something that actually has numbers on it, which is a numeric rating scale, all the way down to something that our group developed, which is called the Itchy Quant, which has cartoon annotations, so that if you have somebody who's a little bit cognitively challenged or not really getting what these numbers mean, there's some cartoons to attach meaning to it. We also have the Itchy Qual. So somebody who has a lot of burden of disease because of their itch, there are items that are different from the Skindex that are specific to itch. So how are we going to use these patient-reported outcome measures? Well, the Skindex, the Itchy Qual, and whatnot, they are very well-validated instruments, but they're very detailed. That's a good thing because it gives you very, very rich data. But that's a bad thing if you're trying to deploy this in the clinical arena, especially if you want to gather data on a population base. So we need a global measure that patients can fill out on their own, where the data is good enough, and so that we can create a situation where every patient encounter is an opportunity to be a potential discoverable moment. And so that we have population data that is meaningful for both patients as well as dermatologists. So in our Emory group, along with Meg Kren, we've tried to address this problem. We've developed something called the Skindex Mini. So we have transformed the 16 different items into 3 global items, one for symptom, one for emotion, and one for function. And we've just recently published the validity of this particular instrument. What we'd like to do is to incorporate this into something that we're calling the Standard Dermatology Outcome Measure, so that it's a short tool that incorporates global measures. We can give it to patients ahead of time, maybe even online or on a tablet, that can be integrated into the electronic medical record that would pop up like a vital sign once a patient went in to see the patient. And it would provide useful data for population research. So this is kind of what our version of the SDOM looks like. It first identifies what the patient is most concerned about, so you know what these answers relate to. It has the itchy quant. People can answer 0, but if they are itching, we want to know that. And then this is that Skindex Mini, which gives you an idea of how symptomatic or emotionally bothered or functionally bothered they are by this condition. And then we have some answers that, or some questions that addresses whether or not their treatment was good enough and whether or not they have side effects. This takes 5 minutes to complete. What we're hoping to do is to add on the Itchy Qual Mini such that if they itch above a certain threshold, then they actually take the Itchy Qual, because itch is obviously their primary issue, as opposed to the Skindex, but this is still in development. So now I've given you a flavor of what we do as outcomes research. So how are we impacting other researchers? Well, I'd submit to you that outcomes research can actually open doors and identify novel opportunities for bench research. So for the longest time, pruritus was the Rodney Dangerfield of our whole discipline. Nobody gave it any respect. Nobody really wanted to treat it. Clinicians would really try not to have those kinds of patients in their clinics. But with the development of some tools to be able to quantify itch, pruritus research is really starting to become pretty sexy. So as clinical trialists are trying to figure out how to convince the FDA to treat itch as a disease maybe and not just a symptom, more pharma and more basic scientists are paying attention to itch, and they're looking at the etiology, pathophysiology, and targets such that we can develop drugs to help our itchy patients. Outcomes research is also very relevant for patient care. So back to the immunotherapy example. We know that these immunotherapies have a lot of immunotoxicity. About 90% of patients who go on immunotherapy will develop some sort of side effect, and the majority of those are actually cutaneous side effects. So maybe if we can catch the itch and the rash early, we can ameliorate those symptoms so that patients won't be tempted to stop therapy. And equally importantly, maybe the oncologist won't slap some systemic steroids on the patient and then blunt that sort of immune response that we're hoping for. The other thing that we can do is if we can catch the itch or the rash or both early, maybe we can predict other types of toxicity such as GI or endocrine or even the late neurotoxicity that actually can kill the patient. I want to point out a paper that was actually kind of cool, recently published, where it shows that outcomes research can take all of this to another level. So they had some cancer patients, close to 800 cancer patients, and they randomized them into 2 arms. One was a usual care arm. The other one were given patient-reported outcomes, 12 of the most common symptoms, and these were sent to them electronically. And on a weekly basis, they answered these 12 questions. If they triggered anything by saying yes, a nurse practitioner would call them, bring them in, and triage them to the appropriate subspecialty. By doing that, what they found was a statistically significant difference between the 2 arms. These are the same cancer patients adjusted in the same way. Those that got those patient-reported outcomes lived 5 months longer. So I want to conclude with some more thought-provoking kinds of ideas here. So Bob likes to hand me these articles. And one of these that I actually read was this New England Journal one, which really got me thinking. And that is, disease is really pretty complicated. So it's definitely not a static process. If you look at this picture here on your left-hand side, you can see that our mortality is improving. But if you look at the distribution of the different diseases that we have, it's quite different. So disease is definitely not static. And what the article says is that therapies take a long time to develop. Disease does not wait for people to develop those therapies. So physicians took credit for the decline of tuberculosis because we discovered antibiotics. But actually the decline happened before Koch really discovered M. tuberculosis and before we even developed new antibiotics. And really that improvement is now credited to the fact that we had improvement in our standard of living. There were no longer those crowded conditions. The other main point that this article points out is that disease is not just molecular pathways and technical problems that need a treatment or some sort of cure. It's very complicated, and we need to take into account the human experience. So what really got me was they're pointing out that right now we know that there is a gap in life expectancy between blacks and whites. And that provokes a lot of outrage, a lot of questions, a lot of conversations about the inequity in healthcare and access and whatnot. But there's also a similar gap between men and women, and that does not provoke a similar outrage. So is it because there's just a natural difference between men and women? Well, back in the 19th century, the life expectancy was actually equivalent, and nobody questioned it then. So I think that as doctors, like this article suggests, but I think we need to broaden it further. As scientists, we really do need to acknowledge that disease is very complex and that we need to take that into account as we move forward in our science. I want to acknowledge Bob Swirlick, who's given me lots and lots of opportunities to do lots and lots of things. I also want to acknowledge Meg Kren, who was my mentor back in my fellowship days, and then Bridget Bradley and our Dermatology Center for Outcomes Research team, because they really are my team. And I want to acknowledge all the funding agencies that have made this career possible. Thank you.
Presentation. Dr. Chen, this is a medal from the Society and a small honorarium. Thank you very much.
Thank you.